so much for the invite. Thank you, Saswat, before you run away. It's great pleasure to be here. And I know you've been talking about a lot of stuff for the last few days. Oh, after that, are you sure you would have to wait till I finish to make sure that you want to give it or not? Thank you. Yeah, so I had some brief idea of what you have been doing, and I'm sure it's been a lot of interesting stuff with Ian and Janie and Ashish was here in the morning, you said. So I thought about it, and I've been wondering how do I want to address this question? And the larger question I want to address is the question not just of technology, but what it is to study technology. And it's not just study technology in a very loose sense. Since you've been hearing a lot of philosophical reflections on technology, I want to ask the question, what does it mean to philosophically study technology? What are we supposed to do? As students of, I'm sure many of you have are students of philosophy or of other disciplines, and I think the real distinction between philosophy and the social sciences or humanities is not really worth making, in the sense you could make it as disciplinary perspectives, draw boundaries, but really in terms of asking the question, how do I approach the question of technology? And that should immediately resonate with you the so-called, the most famous essay probably read by all Indian students, or at least a very large number of them, The Question Concerning Technology by Heidegger. And for some odd reason it's very popular. I can't make, I don't know why, but it's a very good title. I want to work with that title. So I actually suggested to Saswat that I want to start with the title, The Question Concerning Technology. But what is really the question concerning technology, and how do I ask it, or how will you ask it in your situatedness of being what you are, or what all of us are, and then ask the question of technology. Now I want to focus on one aspect of this. You could do a lot of approach of how you study technology. You have sociology of technology, history of these are all separate disciplines, and I'm sure you are well aware of them. There's a whole discipline called technology studies. You could do history, sociology, philosophy, politics, whatever you want you can do. Gender and technology is a very big issue, and so on. But when I'm trying to connect to what you have heard from other speakers before, particularly Ian and others, we've been talking about Deleuze or continental thought and so on. I want to come back to a much lower level of thinking, because I can't aspire to reach the heights of understanding of Deleuze and others. I just don't get it. So I want to go back to a very simple way of asking this question. What do I philosophically mean, or what do I mean when I say I want to philosophically encounter the problem of technology? And for us, and I'm saying this location and situatedness is extremely important. And so what I'm saying is also very political. So I want to begin with that, so I don't want to give you some kind of philosophy which we all don't understand, but in the end it sounds profound. So I want to go back to very simple politics of it, which is to ask, what is this access to philosophy that we have, from which I can ask the question, what is a philosophy of technology? What are people like Deleuze and others doing? What kind of philosophy are they using in order to do something to this idea of technology? And what can all of us, given the situation that we belong to, what resources do we have to ask this question? Okay? And the first, why this is a very important problem in my view, and I think it's an extremely important problem for all of you, I think, is because there are 2 points of contention if I want to say I want to study technology or a philosophy of technology. 2 things I don't understand in that. One is technology. What exactly do we mean by technology? And the other is, what exactly is philosophy or the doing of philosophy in India mean? Where is our understanding of philosophy coming from? What does it mean to do philosophy in India? And this, I hope you will recognize, is a question which is I'm trying to get us to think together about the nature of disciplines, how they come into being, and how we inherit certain things and assume that that's the kind of philosophy that we actually get. So I'll give you an example of why I think is an extremely important question, which of course has been a point of debate among many people now. I think a couple of years back, one of the readings I gave you, I think it was Location of Humanities. You may not have had time to read the readings, but it was anyway sent to you, so you can read it whenever you want. It actually, that paper is actually part of a larger not a conference, a small group of people we met in Bombay. This was on, it's called the Global Humanities Project. It was basically driven by Sheldon Pollock and his 2 or 3 colleagues on asking the question of what does it mean to do humanities in other parts of the world. And the group of people, you know, I was representing India, there was somebody from Middle East, China, Taiwan, South Africa and so on. So there are just about a bunch of us, and the whole journal, I mean that article is part of a special series of which there are about 6 or 7 pieces from different parts of the world on what is it to do humanities. So those of you who are interested in that should look at the whole, you know, series of these articles in that Global Humanities thing. And the real question which we were engaging with is this, that, you know, to do philosophy for us, or to do English for us, or literature as a discipline, or even sociology for us, is quite different from the way it is practiced and produced in other universities abroad. You know, for ease of use, so that we understand loosely what we are saying, you could call this the West and the East, or whatever, or West and India. In more quote unquote, let me call it this way, technologically advanced societies, you have and the universities therein, you have particular ways of understanding the idea of humanities, particular ways of understanding what philosophy is. And one of the great challenges to philosophy is not about whether we understand all these philosophers from the West or East or whatever, but whether we know what we are supposed to do when we say I want to do philosophy. So typically what do? You will say, if you do an undergrad education or maybe masters in philosophy, you will say, well, read some philosophers. So a lot of philosophy gets reduced to philosophers. So you end up saying Plato said it, this fellow said it, that fellow said it. There are very few women who said anything, because philosophy is quite a anti-woman community, and the history of the discipline is very not sensitive to gender at all. And so, you know, you have a series of people who said certain things, and to do philosophy very often we might mistake as quoting what other people have said about something. And this is a very important problem for us, because if you look at world history of philosophy and ask what is the contribution of scholarship, for example from India and many other countries, to philosophy, to text all of you would read as what you call as philosophy, it is going to be, you know, very minimal. We are in a place in Bengal which has a grand tradition of philosophy, and I don't know if those who have done philosophy, whether you have done K.C. Bhattacharya in your classes. You know, if for all of us who are very excited about German writers, you should go read K.C. Bhattacharya, because if there is anybody who wrote, who really understood the phenomenological tradition at the same time as Husserl's works, it was K.C. Bhattacharya. Very influential, very powerful work, you know, nobody knows about it. Husserl was a very big deal. I mean, his phenomenological, you know, I am sure you people have done Husserl in phenomenology, is a very important facet of what constitutes philosophy today. But there is not just K.C. Bhattacharya, but a horde of others whom you have no clue about. And it is not that KCB was working on what is called Indian philosophy or whatever philosophy. That's really not the point. The point is, there's a very deep historical problem about philosophy and both the idea of philosophy and the idea of India. And I'm saying this because for us to be able to even ask what does it mean to do philosophy of technology, you first need to know what does it mean to do philosophy for us here. Okay, so I'm entering into that detour. Hopefully through that you will be able to read Deleuze and what you have heard about it quite differently and maybe very creatively and hopefully organically in some sense. I will give you another example as an entry point. I do not know how many of you saw the piece by J. Garfield and Van Norden in New York Times a few months back, or it was late last year. It was J. Garfield is a American scholar who works on Buddhism, and Van Norden works on Chinese philosophy. So they wrote a very provocative piece in New York Times which said that all the Western university departments should rename their philosophy department. They should not call them Department of Philosophy, but they should call them Department of Western Philosophy or European Philosophy, because they were making a point which many of us who are involved in this thing called philosophy for years have been saying, which is that the definition of philosophy by definition has excluded very many aspects of philosophical thinking of a variety of cultures, and therefore by default, if you are going to ask how do I think about technology, you are going to ask what are the resources for me to philosophically think about technology. What are you going to look at? How do you know what to go look at? Are you going to say, well, let me start with the Greeks, or let me start with of course the continental tradition now? How do you even decide, how do you choose a philosophical tradition that can make can give you meaningful insights on your question? So when J. Garfield and Van Norden wrote this piece, they were saying, look, there are so many philosophical traditions like the Indian, the Chinese, etc., and the African, but the fact that Western philosophical departments in these universities refuse to understand these traditions as if they are part of philosophy means that they are they propagate a particular view of philosophy as being completely exclusive within certain traditions of European and Anglo-American thought. And it then immediately of course people distributed all over India and everywhere else, and they were quite happy about it, I think, because somebody else said what they said, and also it was published in New York Times and so on. And then recently this is another piece which were in the web which went to a lot of us, and it was by Van Norden again in this online journal called Aeon, AEON, the philosophy kind of an online site. And there he begins by saying Western philosophy is xenophobic and racist and misogynist or whatever, And the point he was trying to make is that Western philosophy, that's the point he began with, and said, why then cannot you teach other kinds of philosophical traditions, the Asian and the African, the subaltern, and the wide variety of possible ideas of philosophy? How is it that you exclude them from our understanding of philosophy? Okay, and again a lot of people distributed it, etc., etc., and it's a very odd paradox that we are in, because to understand what happened with J. Garfield and Van Norden's piece, you have to actually understand why the definition of philosophy as we understand it today, and why you are actually reading these these continental tradition or analytical tradition, whatever, in order to talk about technology surrounding you. Why we are doing that is not because of any obvious natural definition of philosophy. It is an extremely calculated exclusionary history of how philosophy as an idea becomes established in Europe. There is a very good book by Peter Park, I hope, and definitely I think all of you should read it. So let me give you the correct title. Like I always do with books, I just go to LibGen, or my students can find books, whichever books you want, they find it for me. But if you are not getting it, tell me, I'll get it for you. There is no point in buying these books, including my books. I just put everything on LibGen myself. Okay, I'm just trying to see, make sure the title of the book is right. Peter Park's book is called Africa, Asia and the History of Philosophy, and the subtitle is Racism in the Formation of the Philosophical Canon 1780 to 1830. It's published by SUNY Press, I think it's 2014. Definitely read it or download it from whatever website you can get and go through it. He is a historian, and as a historian he is actually pointing to a very important politics of the idea of philosophy. Have you seen that book? Okay. Since you are nodding, I thought maybe you had some idea of the book. Okay. So what he is saying is very simple. I mean, very briefly, you should look at the kind of material in it. Very good historical work on this. He makes a very interesting claim, and that's the point of the book. He says between 1780 to 1830, in 50 years, there is a complete removal of Asian and African philosophies from the idea of philosophy. And it occurs for a very clear reason. It doesn't occur because they suddenly discover that European philosophy or Greek philosophy is the real philosophy. And we should remember that there is nothing called Greek philosophy which is available to you. It comes filtered through Islamic philosophers. It comes filtered through a very contentious history into Europe, a rediscovery of that. So what Peter Park is saying is this. He points out that in 18th century Europe, there are only three serious options in the history of philosophy. So what was he trying to say? He was saying that the three options in 18th century Europe which were accepted as given in that history of philosophy is that one, philosophy began in India, two, philosophy began in Africa, and three, India and Africa gave philosophy to Greece. And there are very interesting accounts of how philosophy was actually understood in Europe at that time and how it impacted the general understanding of what philosophy was. So perhaps if you are in 1730 studying in Germany, you would actually have been studying more Indian philosophy and African philosophy than you do today in India, and that's something to think about. But what is more important point to think about is what happened to this change, what really happened and why did it happen. Park's point is this, and as I said, it's a very detailed historical work, so you should really look at the details of what he is trying to do. And his argument is that the denial of a philosophical tradition to Asia and Africa begins in 1780s, and it is championed by neo-Kantians, deeply inspired by very problematical accounts of Kant, which have been seen as racist accounts of who has the capacity to do philosophy, including it's not just racist, it's really not complimentary to women either. And what he points out is that this neo-Kantian, the neo-Kantians really pick up on this as a part of a larger historical formulation of philosophy as a value of European thought, which then becomes a value of white European thought. And he points out that it's particularly Christoph Meiners, 1747 to 1810, who really spearheads this neo-Kantian movement to displace the idea of African and Asian philosophy from the definition of philosophy. And it's quite startling when he points out that by the time of Hegel's death, there's a complete absence of Africa and Asia from philosophy departments, and Park says, quote, within one generation, and he's really looking at 50 years, as I said, from 1780 to 1830, within one generation, academic philosophers succeeded in excluding the non-European world and in consolidating a canon of philosophy that powerfully legitimized these disciplines. In other words, why I was mentioning this to you is the fact that the very idea of what constitutes philosophy is not easily available to us. And part of the struggle with this global humanities project that we are doing is also to say, how then do you reconceive of what it is to do philosophy in India? Because for you to even think of what it is to do philosophy of technology, you need to really know what it is to do philosophy in India in order to be able to make sense of what it is to do philosophy of technology in India. Or you will have to assume that this historical tradition of philosophy which we inherit in our departments and in our communities will then be the framework by which you will encounter, describe the Indian experiences or the experiences around you. You don't have to call it Indian or Western, etc. The experiences around you. And remember that this is not a very innocent shift. It's not about the cognitive capacities. It's not even about disciplinary structures. It's really simple politics. And the politics of it, according to these great accounts, I mean not just this book, including with J. Garfield's and Van Norden's pieces, is racism. Which means you have to encounter the question of racism at the heart of the understanding of constitution of philosophy which we inherit in these various ways. And we don't know how to deal with it. But there are other people trying to deal with it. I'll give you an example. A few weeks back I was in Canada and in one of the universities there, and in the philosophy department we wanted to have a discussion of something. And I said, you know, I was very curious to see why is it that the philosophical community around the world does not teach thematics from Asian and Chinese or Asian and African philosophies as part of philosophy rather than as part of religious studies or part of something else called as other philosophy. And this is really not about India or China or the West. I'll give you a very simple example, you know, about something which I'm sure many of you would have studied, the question of causality, for example. Okay, so if you have, and causality is a problem which philosophers really like, across the, you know, especially the analytical tradition really enjoys the question of causality because there are a lot of very interesting questions to ask about causality. And if you look at, you know, you take a course in causality, you will begin first, of course, the must Aristotelian 4 kinds of causality. Then you will of course come to Hume, and of course then with Kant, who presumably offers you a different way of understanding causality. And then you have a particular history of how the idea of causality is presented to you. Now, what is interesting is that the idea of causality has no allegiance to Europe or India or China or whatever. It's an idea of causality. And presumably we would think, as good philosophers who want to understand the phenomena of what causality is, that you would be willing to engage with very many traditions which have talked about causality in very interesting ways. Every Indian philosophical tradition engages very deeply with the question of causality because causality is a central question for them for various reasons. There are many types of causality, like the Aristotelian kinds of causality. The Nayayikas do it, the Buddhists do it, the Jainas do it. I mean, every tradition does it. Chinese philosophy has very deep reflections on the nature of causality. What is it that when you say something is causing something, what could it mean, etc. But I think the point of Garfield and Warden was, and what others have been saying before them, was that why is it then that to do causality within a philosophy department, you think that the other views on causality cannot be taught as if it is a tradition of philosophy, right? I mean, if you want to understand causality, why should it matter to you where it is coming from? When you can place different traditions within Europe, for example, talking to each other, what is it that makes you exclude a very large tradition of other philosophical thinkers on the same topic of causality or of space or of time? You know, you read philosophy of space today and philosophy of time, you will think that there are only this bunch of 10 guys sitting in Europe who have thought about this, and then we all reproduce it. We teach it, we write about it, we reproduce it, and we think that's all. Oh, these are the only people. And you should wonder then, how is it that only these people thought of something as fundamental as space, time and causality, or mass, matter? or the nature of reality, metaphysics, ethics. What is it? I mean, how do we make sense of it? So, do we either inherit a philosophical tradition which is quite artificial and perform within it in a very mimetic fashion, or we contribute to the growth of it, but the contribution to the growth of it is a very deep problem. If you see the intellectual contribution of Indian scholars to world, philosophy, for example. So, this is a serious question, because now philosophy is going to appear as a kind of a meaningful instrument by which you are going to make sense of the world around you, including this larger question of technology. I am sure that, Sasha is saying there are many sociology students and so on, and I do not know how many of you, when you first encounter Indian sociology and the question of caste, which we all now recognize, I have always recognized as one of the most important and a unique kind of conceptual construction of Indian society, you would have, I am sure, read the three most dominant writers on caste, Max Weber, Durkheim and Dumont. So, here you have a very interesting flip of the possibility that the people who represent your experiences to you, your everyday experiences which are represented to you through frameworks which simulate a kind of universality, they are the people who are going to give you a way to make sense of understanding the experiences around you. And I really think one of the great problems in the study of caste in India has been as much contributed by such so-called theoretical reflections on caste as of various other social and political factors. And as students who consume this, we need to ask, how would we respond to this? And that is why I said it's actually a kind of a political agenda, and it has a long history. These are not contemporary politics, these are very old ancient politics, and it's particularly true in the case of technology. So, what I was telling you till now is that the question of philosophy which you inherit is to be questioned on very fundamental grounds, which means you have to ask the question, when you say you want to do philosophy of technology, what do you want to do? How do you want to do it? What does it mean for us to do it? We do not have immediate access to resources like Plato, Aristotle or Kant or Hume and say, well, these are the given texts, and then of course later on we have various other philosophers as the given ways of thinking about technology which we can access. We need to be able to rethink that question. So, the question concerning technology is really about our capacity to rethink what we mean when we want to say, I want to philosophically explore this idea. The second point, which is very deeply historical connected to this, is the question of technology, and both of them have a very deep and interesting relationship in this historical context, because technology, if there is one element of Indian society, when I mean Indian, a lot of people get, when we talk of Indian, a lot of people get really worried about the term. So, why do you say Indian, what do you mean by Indian, etc. But when I say Indian, I mean it as loose as German or French or American or whatever. So, you can read it whichever way you understand those terms. But in the context of what we mean by the question of technology in Indian societies, is that if there is one aspect of the history of ancient and medieval India which has often been kept aside in especially in preference to other kinds of narratives about the larger societies of the country, it is the question of technology. That is something very fascinating about the engagement of the idea of technology within ancient India onwards, and it has also got a very deep connection to the way technology itself gets defined by the British. So, very briefly I will give you this link, so that we need to, as I said, we need to understand what we mean by both technology and philosophy before we can make any meaningful intervention. There are very good accounts of technological production in India, and if you want to understand the sociology of technological production in India, it is for example, some of the best, most famous technological innovations in India ancient India occur in metallurgy. Metallurgy was really the peak of contribution with hand with the Indian in the various Indian societies. And for example, there are two great examples, much studied and definitely from in a Indian Institute of Technology, and I hope some of you would have encountered these examples at least, for at least those of you who are students of IITs. Two great examples are, one is steel, what is called ukku, and that's the name of steel actually. In the south, both Kannada, Telugu, they are still called ukku. The other is the example of zinc, but there are many examples of metallurgical products which were part of in a sense part of the social world in a very fundamental sense. And what does it mean? What do I mean by that is that alloy making as a metallurgical art or craft or whatever you want to call it was extremely advanced. The steel which was being made was made by a very special process, and it is a carbonized process, which is a very interesting process. It's actually the household tandoor, the tandoor things you make rotis. The steel is made like tandoori rotis, small tandoors which are baked. You put these ores in it, put leaves and twigs in it, and melt it and extract very, very high quality steel, to the extent that even in the early 80s, India was producing enough steel for export for the famous Damascus swords in Persia, and Roman cutlery, to make Roman cutlery, because they were seen to be very high quality steel. Similarly, zinc, which was very much used as part of these idol making, the alloy making, was also it's a very difficult process. In fact, in Europe you do not find the capacity for zinc making much later till about 18th, 19th century. Nobody knew how to do it, and this was such a common practice. In fact, even today you go to Rajasthan, you will see the practice of zinc making, and in fact one of the biggest India's zinc making companies actually in Rajasthan, which I found once as a great coincidence, because we are talking about zinc making plants in Rajasthan, and then even the modern plant run by the government is also there in Rajasthan. So here was this a series of historical references and presence and the capacity to make these extremely high quality metal products, right, along with so many other things. I mean, that's why I said these were not part of the Brahminical tradition. These are not part of the so-called knowledge producing traditions, either of philosophy or of mathematics or of astronomy, and these are the the major contributions from Indian thought comes from that. And these were done by blacksmiths, these are done by people of various vocations, and they were actually producing the kind of stuff which modern industries begin to do in 19th century. In fact, the British process of making steel was very ineffective, and the discovery of the tandoor, this ukku steel making, which goes to Britain, gets absorbed into their formulation of steel making. It makes the process very efficient, and it comes back to India and becomes the basis on which the first major Indian steel plant is built. And when Edward Heath, who was the man behind this, was asked about this transfer of ideas of technology from steel making in India to Britain and back, he said a very important sentence which has resonated throughout history in various ways, which influences our understanding of technology. What he said was that there is no intellectual, I mean, he didn't use IP, but in our terms, there is no intellectual property to the making of steel with the Indians, because they were producing high quality steel to the extent that they were exporting it very widely, but they did not know what they were doing. This idea, because it's a very extremely important idea, because it's part of their idea which becomes influential to Kant, neo-Kantians, to Hegel's understanding of Indian philosophy, to Husserl's rejection of Indian philosophy, you know, all of it comes from the fact that which denies a particular capacity, either the capacity of philosophy or the capacity for knowing what you are doing. So, let me give you another instance so that you understand, I think, the politics and the significance of it. If some of you were aware of this book Cracked Mirror, which I wrote with Gopal Guru, and part of that debate begins with Gopal Guru's point, if some of you remember, I think a very powerful invocation by Gopal about the term empirical Shudras and theoretical Brahmins. And the idea is that the way in which the caste society gets ordered is by looking at some people as just empirical subjects who will have to be who do not have the capacity for self understanding, and you will need other kinds of resources in order to be able to understand and describe them. And the way in which Indian technology gets read by the colonial discourse first by the British, and in parallel with the neo-Kantian discourse in Germany, and also with Locke and Hume and others in the British empiricist tradition, is exactly the same way. That is, these people were doing this stuff of technology, but they didn't know what they were doing, and therefore, and you will have to see why this is very significant. Okay, it's very significant because then it tells you that to understand these processes of technology, you will need other kinds of structures to be able to reflect on it, because you do not have the intellectual wherewithal to be able to understand what you are doing. So, you could have a society which reproduces caste in many terrible ways over and over in spite of various kinds of mobilizations against it, but yet you will say we do not have the wherewithal to understand from your perspective, from your set of quote unquote theoretical capacity to be able to reflect on your experiences of caste. And the question of technology is exactly like that. The history of technology is written on this basis, that you do not, there are no resources available in the Asian and the African civilizations which will allow them a way to make sense of this enormous product of production of technological products. One very good analogy which I think is very useful is this, I am sure again many of you would have heard about the Dalai Lama's, Dalai Lama is very fascinated with science, and he also wants to promote Buddhist philosophy as a very meaningful contemporary process of thinking, and he thinks that it is only through the encounter of Buddhism with modern science that this is possible. So, all the monks in his various monasteries have to do physics, they actually have modern physics. He is particularly enamored of quantum physics, and he does not think that to do quantum physics you have to do other kinds of physics so that you understand quantum physics better, but anyway all these monks listen to all this stuff about wave particle duality and all that stuff. And so he has been having many of these conferences, and in one of them was in Sarnath, where I was also there. I like going there because the monks are very nice, very sweet people. That's really, I don't think the dialogue has ever worked well, and I don't think that's the way to approach it, but they're genuinely wonderful people. And but this is the Sarnath was a very good illustration of this larger problem of theory and the empirical, that is technology, philosophy, society, social processes, social theory and so on, the tension between them. In this meeting there are there's thousands, it's a huge thing, and there are thousands of monks sitting, and we had some talks by a few of us who were talking about various things, and there was this person who is a very who's worked extensively. She's a neurobiologist, clinical, she does medical experiments on the human brain, and there have been many attempts to map the human brain while the Buddhist monks were involved in meditation. So there's a very famous form of meditation which the Dalai Lama group is particularly known for, called the compassionate meditation, And what she does is she took some subjects, these monks who are involved in compassionate meditation, and she puts various electrodes in them and then maps the brain activities during that act. And what was the whole point of that talk? So she is showing all these pictures. She says, you know, I had these monks, I did these tests, and this is what is happening to your brain. And what she was saying was this, that all of you are doing compassionate meditation, which you are very good at, because obviously none of the others can do it. You are very good and you do it, you have been trained for long and you do compassionate meditation, but you don't know why it works. That is, compassionate meditation becomes a practice, and the monks become empirical subjects who do not have the capacity for theoretical reflection on their practices. So in this case, modern medical science is going to come and interpret to these people what is actually happening, because they presumably have no clue why it happens. And obviously I am sure you will see a very fundamental illogic of the whole thing, which is what? That the discovery of compassionate meditation is not an accident. It is not, as we are very fond of saying, an apple which fell from the tree on the whosoever discovered compassionate meditation. It didn't fall on Newton's head anyway, but you know, in this case definitely it didn't fall and say, oh, that's compassionate meditation. Why compassionate meditation is discovered or becomes a part of Buddhist practice is because they first have a theory of body and mind. It arises from their theoretical reflection from the nature of body and mind, over which they develop a series of practices which enables them to understand or to develop the technique, which is what we understand as meditative techniques. The problem is, for this modern medical science, their framework of the body and the mind has no correlation with the framework of the body of the Buddhist theories of body and mind. So rather than engage with that, it becomes far easier to convert all the monks into empirical subjects and then look for the theoretical framework from somebody who will come and liberate you. You know, the true liberation for us is theory, which we are all waiting for and seeking for, right? And then when these come, and then you say, wow, now I know what to make sense of the world around me. And that's part of the problem of why theory in India has been so weak, why the contributions to social theory from India, forget about philosophy, has been so weak. Other than the larger socio-political fact that we don't even teach people like A.C. Bhattacharya and others, like I told you, as part of what it is to do philosophy in India, because we don't know what it is to do philosophy in India. And constantly in philosophy departments, I don't know how many of you are from directing philosophy departments, but I'm sure you've heard enough of this. Constantly it's often a battle between, should I do Western philosophy or Indian philosophy, or will I do one Indian philosophy paper 1 and Indian philosophy paper 2? I have no clue what these things mean. And of course we never engage with Chinese philosophy or African philosophy, or we don't engage with Japanese and Korean thoughts on social formation, social processes, because we have really no clue how to do it. So I'm saying the Neo-Kantian project about philosophy has been very successful, and but we need to figure out what it is to recover the possibility of philosophical thinking for us. And there are no easy things. I'm not saying you then go back and look at what is seen as Indian philosophy or Chinese. I don't know, I have no clue. We have tried various experiments in all these years. Some of them have worked, some of them haven't. But I think this is a constant dialogue. But the first step in the dialogue is our capacity to critically understand what we receive, what we think we receive in the name of philosophy. Okay, so the question of the question of technology, therefore, one, because of its exclusion, technology therefore in the Indian context gets presented as this empirical domain of available things around you, but no unificatory theoretical move which can somehow bring them together. Because you need to ask the question, what then would constitute technology in this tradition? So let us assume that you have this long tradition of things. How then would you look at it? How would we actually, how have the forms of thinking engaged with making sense of these technological artifacts? And you will see that there are various wide representations, and in one of my sessions, perhaps the last one, I will look at this question of performance and technology, something which really animates the question of technology, not just in its historical process, but also as very much contemporary social practice, and how technology is actually taken into a performative idiom, which is also very important because it's also a very important shift in STS, or science and technology studies, to move from the analytic idiom to the performative idiom, and we will see whether we can make sense of it in that manner. A lot of this is also related to the third question, which you need to know in order to understand what we mean by science, especially what we mean by technology, especially in the context of modern technology, and that is its relationship to science. So here are these three basic conceptual terms which are very difficult for us to deal with. One is the question of technology, as I mentioned, with the particular kind of a history which is available to it. Then you have the question of philosophy, which is this other problematical thing we talked about, and the third one is the concept of science. So in many of the frameworks in which you understand modern technology today, it's very deeply associated with the idea of science. But the conceptual trajectory of science in the Indian context has been as contentious as that of technology and philosophy. In fact, science perhaps has been far more contentious for the following reason. And science is something, especially because it becomes a deeply valued conceptual term for modern India, for independent India. It is something which you need to pay attention to, because modern technology's association with modern science is actually quite complex. Many times it may seem to be reducible to a one direction from science to technology, but as I am sure those of you who have studied something of technology studies would know that that's a far more complex process. It's not a one movement from science to something called technology and so on. But part of the problem in this, our understanding of technology, also arises from our understanding of science. And why does science become such a contentious term within a history of India in any sense? Just like technology and philosophy become very contentious terms in a global history of philosophy, for example, so too does science. And part of the reason is political, and I think it's also something which we all, I wouldn't say suffer from, but we all are responding to in various ways even today, which is the fact that science becomes an extremely important defining conceptual category of the possibility of modern India. Imagination of independent India begins with the imagination of science. As I am sure all of you are aware, I would presume, that India, as far as I have been able to find out, it's the only country, and if any of you know, if the case in other countries, it would be useful to know. And what are we so unique about? It's only in the Indian Constitution that you have a clause which says, out of your many constitutional duties that you have, one of them is to have scientific temper. None of your highly so-called advanced science technological societies have your constitutional duty for its citizens to have scientific temper. The Indian Constitution, out of this listing those 10 or whatever constitutional duties, says it's the duty, a constitutional duty of Indian citizens to have scientific temper, and nobody knows what it means, definitely not the scientists. But the question of scientific temper has been a very important, why do I say it's a part of a modern imagination of modern India? And I really think without this history you can't make sense of what's happening with technology today, and that's the reason I'm giving you this history. Why would it be such an important part of the imagination of modern India? Because what is scientific temper supposed to do to all of us as constitutional duty? Let's assume as constitutional duty, I presume we all have to have scientific temper. And if you have scientific temper, what's going to happen? What's going to happen according to the, these fathers of our constitution is that you will no longer be a superstitious society. You will no longer, science in this sense, scientific temper allows you an escape from your traditional practices. Tradition, superstition, and a very unrelated, unwritten term which is present deeply within it, religion. In fact, very often in the history of science, and this is a story we have heard so many times that you should start, when you hear a story so often, then you should go back and look at the history of it to make sure that it's the right story. That's how fake news works, right? It gets repeated so often that you think it's true. Very often history of science comes to us as if the real origin of modern science is with this conflict with religion. And Galileo's Copernicus story is an extremely important one. But you should go back and read Galileo's story. What did he really do, and what was his relationship with the church? It tells you a very different story. The conflict which Galileo has with the church is far more complex than just saying, oh, I am going against the church. There was a very specific doctrine, of course, of the heliocentric geocentric question, but it is also very well known how Galileo actually is treated in his response, when he gives a response and when he wants to stick to this heliocentric story. The real question is not about a conflict between some idea of science and something called religion or church. There is definitely a conflict in a particular sense of the term vis-a-vis certain descriptions of natural phenomena. It is not a denial of religious tenets that is at stake. What is at stake is a denial of particular positions about the natural world, which church wants to have a say and physics wants to have a say. So it's also very interesting in the Indian context. You do not have this conflict between religion and science. Science in what sense? You should also remember, okay, I'm coming to that because that's a very important way to we're talking about the question of science, right? So the idea of science. So this idea of science, which is in part of our constitutional duty to have scientific temper, that idea of science is actually based on a very false understanding of science. It's a science which arises in some odd way, which is definitely not the European experience of science, which arises in some odd way as if it is everything about science is against everything against religion, and that somehow doing science will help you get rid of caste prejudices, will liberate you from all your prejudices towards women and people and other things, and somehow the idea of scientific temper is going to liberate you towards a world free from superstition and religion. And that's an ideal which has never worked even in part in the Indian constitution. And definitely if you look at, in fact, one of the biggest challenges, one of the very well-known science figures, this was a story told to me by Pushpa Bhargava, who many of you might know is a very well-known scientist, science popularizer, and he was also one of the leading proponents of the scientific temper document in India. So in the 70s, when he recounted the story, he said that a lot of scientists were very perturbed at the growing rate of non-scientific, superstitious practices and religious beliefs in India. So they got together and drafted another pledge to scientific temper in the 70s, because to revive this whole idea from the constitution. And he said they got the draft and they wanted it signed by a lot of people so that they would go to the government. And then he said it actually failed. They couldn't, get enough support to do it, and the reason it failed, he said, was because many scientists refused to sign it. It was the scientists who didn't buy into that story of scientific temper as eradicating superstition and religion, which is then spread to the so-called lay people, that we are all supposed to have scientific temper in order to change the character of Indian society from a traditional religious one to a modern scientific one. So the point here is about the difficulty in defining the idea of science, and therefore for us to be able to understand where the question of technology in the Indian experiential context is going to come from, as I said, one, a philosophical problem of saying what to do to reflect on technology, two, technology's relationship with science. And one of the ways in which I think that's another set of readings which we all should be doing. One of the readings I gave you is by Arun Bala's thing. Please look at it if you have time. It's an extremely good book. It's actually an account of what has been called as the multicultural origins of science, and it's a very simple historical account of how modern science arises in Europe. And I mean, Bala's account is one in which many people have been working for quite some time on tracking the influences which leads to Galileo and Copernicus and so on. And one of the important arguments from that is that the possibility, this is a question which was made very famous by a historian of science, Joseph Needham, and I hope some of you have heard of that. Needham's great project, he is a great historian, and I think one of the most influential historians of science that we have had. I think he was at Cambridge, and he did a huge project on science in China. And there is a very famous question he asks, which is often called as a Needham's question. And Needham's question is, why does not modern science begin in China? And it's a question, as I said, it has had a lot of traction. He wrote many volumes on science in China, and the reason he was asking is this, that China had probably, I mean, in terms of technology, if you want to evaluate technological production in a society in terms of the kind of technologies which a society has produced, China far outweighed anything which was done in Europe of its times and also of India. So China's, the kind of work you had in technology and also in mathematics, but to a much lesser extent in the Indian case, because around similar time you had some of the most important developments in mathematics, including in what are called indeterminate equations, algebra, the basic points of right from your solutions to quadratic equations and so on, were done by people like, you had a whole series from Aryabhatta, Brahmagupta, etc. And here you had these two civilizations, China as an embodiment of a very large number of technological production, and India with a very large production of philosophy and mathematics particularly. And yet the transition to what Needham thinks is modern science doesn't happen in China. And as I said, it's a question, Needham's question has been taken over to the Indian context, and people have asked, the Needham question for India is, why did not modern science begin in India? What you mean by that is to say that the conditions necessary for it, that is the kind of equipment you needed for that modern science to begin, was there, and something must have come in the way of the fact that these things did not happen. And so this has been quite a contentious thing in history of science, because it has led to all kinds of explanations, including the fact that why the Chinese and Indians didn't make the transition which supposedly Galileo and Copernicus do. And then we found that much of those accounts of science and the history of science was based on very faulty histories of global science. And one of the, I think the great impact of the multicultural origins of science has been the recognition that modern science begins in Europe in the particular way that it does, largely due to the influence of ideas which come from Greece, China, India, and expanded and protected by the Islamic philosophers. So, if there is one major influence of the ideas of modern science, which becomes very central to the core of modern science, which enters Europe, it comes as a confluence of ideas. It is very special that it happened in Greece, even that, I mean in Europe, and even that is a very a lot of contentious debate on that. I will just give you one example. In 10th century to 12th century Padua, the University of Padua, where briefly Galileo was also there, the syllabus was actually supposedly based on the Arabic syllabus. It was, the Arabic syllabus was actually a model for what constituted very good knowledge system for the Europeans. One of the arguments from that is that the famous model of the heart as a pump, Harvey, we all read in school, was actually part of a Chinese model of the heart. The Chinese had very interesting models of the body, including that of heart. It's also, there have been people fighting about this, whether Chinese really had it or didn't have it, etc. But the fact is that there were ideas which were transmitted from many of these cultures through the Arabs into Europe. And one of the most difficult questions today in history of science, very contentious, again people fight a lot about it, we can discuss why later on, is the example of the heliocentric model. Because if there is one model which tells you the origin of modern, this marker of modern science, it is this idea that the geocentric model is replaced by the heliocentric model, that is, the earth as stationary is replaced by the sun as stationary. And how does Copernicus and Galileo, how does Copernicus come to this recognition? How does Galileo quote unquote prove it? So, when historians track the story down, there are two things which are very important. One, Copernicus is deeply influenced by Tycho Brahe. Tycho Brahe offers what is called a modified heliocentric model. It is a very interesting model in which the earth is still at rest, but all the other planets are going around the sun and the whole system is going around the earth. So, rather than now the planets, we think all the planets go around the earth, right. So, the modified heliocentric model, you have the sun at the center, the planets go around it and the whole system goes around it, and Copernicus builds on it and then comes up with the heliocentric model and so on. Now, what is very interesting is this, that the first account of a modified heliocentric model comes from the Kerala Mathematicians, what are called a group called Kerala Mathematicians and Kerala Astronomers. There has been enough work, any of you can Google and find out what they are doing. There is a book in, I think it is about 1336 or 1340 something, called Yukti Bhasha, which is written in Malayalam, which offers the first accounts of pre-calculus, the first ideas of limits and infinite series. So, here is it's a very interesting puzzle within the history of science, and part of the response to the multicultural origin of science, which is the fact that modern science begins in Europe because of the confluence of ideas from different cultures, as against the appropriation of the scientific mind into the European mind. Remember, that is a very, in fact, one of the parts of the story of philosophy which I was telling you about Peter Park's work, is the fact that science and the fact that Europe supposedly created modern science was a very important factor in discovering values of European thought. In other words, the universality presumably present in science gets appropriated to the universality of the European mind, and that universality has very deep implications for philosophy. That story about philosophy is something I will come very briefly to, very quickly to, but the point what I was trying to say about the fact that you cannot recognize multicultural origins of science as a proper historical account of science means that the question of science itself has become a great point of contention, and the fact that science is therefore appropriated by extreme right as much as the extreme left in two different ways. For the extreme left, it is the idealized version of science, which is that science will function like the constitution expects you to, which is it will eradicate all your kinds of problems, and for the right it is an appropriation of cultural values. So it's between the two that we really have to within India that we really struggle trying to give an account of what science is. But within the colonial discourse, the rejection of science, it goes hand in hand with rejection of technology and goes hand in hand with rejection of philosophy. So if there is one thing common to the colonial discourse, it is this fact, it is this statement, if you like, and the colonial discourse is not just restricted to British alone. Remember that the Germans played a very deep part in it. The rejection of the colonial thing has got three equivalent sentences, which is India, you could replace Asia and Africa there, China, Asia and Africa. India has no science, there is no mathematics in India, because logic and mathematics becomes the real point of your signifiers of rationality, which begins to define the values of hierarchical societies. So the claims that India there is no science in India, there is no logic and mathematics in India, which is quite a shocking account of the way in which you would read mathematics in India, by the way. And there are very good reasons. If there are any questions, I will tell you why they said that. And third, that there is no philosophy in India. And all three of them really are saying something very similar, and they come together in anything we talk about with the respect question of technology. It's impossible to talk about technology it's impossible to talk about technology in India in loosely what we would call as philosophy of technology without taking into account these three historical trajectories of how the very meaning and the concepts of science, technology and philosophy are defined or not defined, and the history that all three of these were denied to the Asian and African experiences. It's impossible for you, and that's my contention. I hope some of you will get up and fight with me about it. You're very welcome. The contention is that you cannot make sense of how we engage with the larger question of technology, whether you want to call it philosophy of technology or sociology of technology or whatever, without being cognizant of these very important problem of these three conceptual terms around which the colonial, the post-colonial and our contemporary experiences work, which means science, technology and philosophy as three contentious conceptual world which we have to find ways to negotiate with. How do we do that? What kind of traditions, what kind of intellectual tools will give you a reflection on that? What will allow you to make sense of certain technological practices? How would you, where are the resources for doing it? How are we supposed to think through it? I'll give you one example, and maybe, what's the time? If there are any questions, I'll stop here. Yeah, okay, I'll just stop with this example and then we can have some questions. Just to tell you the extreme difficulty in interpreting technology in India. This phenomena of offering prayers to machines, right? I'm sure you've seen enough, and probably you've taken your scooters and cars to the temple and get something broken, or you can take it to church. It's quite a syncretic thing. I think it happens across religions, and it's seen as part of Ayuda Puja, etc. I mean, that's part of why the constitution wants us to have scientific temper, so we are not so foolish to do all these things. But then they forgot to tell that to the scientist, as always. And what does it that the scientists do? ISRO, Indian Space Research Organization, which is the most successful Indian science establishment in my opinion. Has the best rate of success as a scientific organization, has produced far more indigenous technology than any other scientific organization in India. One of the most efficient scientific organizations. What do? Before every launch, there are two temples, one Manjunatheshwara in Udupi in Karnataka, one Tirupati temple. Before launch, when they first built their models of satellites and so on, the ISRO scientists would go in Karnataka, they would go to this Manjunatheshwara temple and offer prayers to a model of a satellite. And the model of a rocket from Sriharikota will be taken to the Tirupati temple. They do puja for it, and then the launch happens, the satellite is sent. when I've written extensively about it for many years, but I had never had empirical proof in a sense, because I had heard about it from various people, but I was using it to think about what technologies, etc. And then thankfully the previous chairman of ISRO, and remember the chairman of ISRO is like one of the most powerful guys in the country. Okay, they're all only been guys so far. They are very powerful, they are with the PMO, I mean they are with the Prime Minister, they make decisions on security, they make decisions on enormous amount of funding for science, etc. So this guy, his name is Radhakrishnan, what does he do? He not only, he goes with the model of the, I think it was a GSLV at that time, takes it for this puja and allows himself to be photographed with it. Unfortunately, and the newspapers carried that photograph. And then our rationalist society in India, there's a small group which is always so-called rationalist society, where everything which happens suddenly they'll send out huge letters and all that. So there is a very oddly, there is a very powerful old rationalist society in Mangalore, which I am sure many of you, if you know that part of South India, also know that Mangalore is also become very regressive right-wing group city today. But there is, I don't know if it's because of this rationalist group there or not, but the rationalist group is a very strong base in Mangalore. So they wrote off a big letter saying, how can the chairman of ISRO go and offer a prayer of this model of a rocket? And this is, it's endemic. A sociologist, I don't know if any of you know him, Rennie, who is teaching in Delhi, did his PhD work on studying scientists in the Indian Institute of Science, India's top most rated science institute, which also ranked very high globally, etc. Has very good name as a science institute. And what do? He went and studied Ayudha Puja in IISc, and since my institute is also part of the IISc campus, and we also do Ayudha Puja, which is, you have all these computers in the computer science department, and IISc computer science is the leading edge, because they are setting up this cyber security. I mean, they were doing this, the CERC, the supercomputing center there, etc. On Ayudha Puja day, everybody goes and offers worship to these machines, and then they close everything down. All the scientists are supposed to go, they have a prayers to it and do whatever it is, they do puja to it. And so Rennie calls this as machines are all at rest when they are doing, that day it's at rest or something like that, but it's endemic. And how do we then read these points? So what I'm trying to say is that when people wrote about it initially, like the rationalists, they were very upset. They said, oh, you're bringing religion into science, you're making, in the big science institutes when religion should not be there, you have brought science institutes in it. I don't know if IIT Kharagpur does it, by the way. Do they have Ayudha Puja in IIT Kharagpur? Any of you know? Saras? Okay, Vishwakarma Puja, variation of that, same thing, yeah. So it's they do offer this stuff, right? So so people are immediately jumping around saying, oh, that's bringing religion into science and technology, etc. But I think they are completely wrong about that, because you need a different framework to read it. And where is that framework going to come for you to be able to make sense of these functions of technology? How are we going to think through this question? And so what I am saying is that I am offering to ask you to think anew about the question concerning technology. And if you were supposed to do it given the set of experiences of what you see around you, where would you start? How would you start? What kind of philosophical tools you think will be relevant for you? That's all my interest is. I don't think there are any clear answers which any of us are coming to bringing to you on the board. It is to complement what you already heard and what you will hear, to see how these forms of thinking are happening. And so therefore, to me, philosophy is not going to be about what somebody said and, oh, I can use that to do this, but it's more about how you are able to map those forms of thinking into the set of experiences around you. Okay, and I'll really stop with this, but because this is the starting point of our discussion, so it's important to say this. Bruno Latour, whom all of you know well, I'm sure you all read all this. Once he had come to Bangalore for a day. I was there for 2 days, I think, one night, something. And many of our students at NIAS, where I was at that time, where I am now too, we're all big fans of Latour. They read everything of his, and they could quote 13th page, 6th line and all that. So because they're all great fans. So he was there just for one day, and we were supposed to meet for dinner. And I told him, look, my students are far greater fans of yours, and they would love to meet you and stuff. So he was very kind and gracious, and I took 10 of PhD students, and he was really surprised. I mean, I don't think he ever thought that students knew his work so well, in the sense which book and what he said there, and all that stuff. So he was sufficiently, although he was on a holiday, he was sufficiently, I think, impressed to say, he said he would come to the institute next day to talk to them, because there are some more students whom I wanted him to engage with. And next day when he went, I asked him this, because I wanted him to reflect on this point. So I asked him, aren't you surprised that your work is so influential in India? There are people who are working on how do administrators do education policies in Karnataka? They'll do Bruno Latour. How do you make chai? You can do Bruno Latour. Things like that. So I said, aren't you surprised that your work is of such great people? And you know what he said? He said, I have just come from China, and this, I'm really telling you exactly what he said, but he was not rude, but this is what he said. I think that's a French thing, I suppose. He said, I've just come from China, and I don't care about China or India. When he said, I don't care, he's saying, then he explained, because it sounded very rude. And then he said, I don't understand my society. I think the way in which, France has been understood, and his experiential domain has been understood within modernity, European modernity, he thought it is wrong. He said, my attempt has always been to try and understand that world in which I live in through these frameworks, so I can make sense of it to myself. And he said, the fact that it's all very useful to all of you, he was very puzzled actually. I don't think he really, because he didn't have this grand illusion of universality of his ideas, that they were obviously applicable everywhere, it's going to solve all the conceptual problems, but he didn't have it. He said, yeah, I'm surprised, but if it is, okay, good, if you guys are happy doing it. But he was just puzzled. He said, I am not doing it for that, I'm trying to understand the society I live in. And there's a very important lesson in that. I'm saying that because it's a very important lesson. Where is our engagement coming from, even with respect to question of technology? What does it mean to say, I want to understand the social experiences we are part of? Or is it that theoretical frameworks just become frames of making sense of something, not for really understanding the phenomena, but for other kinds of academic performances? I mean, these are questions, I think, at least since many of you are students starting on perhaps on these disciplines, it may be worth thinking about, something which can stay with you. Okay, I'll just stop here so I won't go on.
Context of my own research works. When I go to field and walk among the research and inquire about this same issues, because I already read some of your works, so that's why I went there with some of these questions to understand their experiential understanding of land relations. So what do they mean by the word development, and how do they explain these things of industry and agriculture and all that? I could find that I could partially understand their experiential world. I could partially understand how that world is interlarded with many other things which we don't discuss by talking of development and all that. But then I also realized, which is where I feel a crisis, I get a tension also, which is that they can't theorize their position, though they are very very aware of the fact that they are deprived, that their caste nature has made them to live in that sort of conditions, that every time they are excluded in some of the narratives. But in spite of that, they can't really theorize their life. They can't really link their religious experience, their land experience, and in that way they actually deal with their everyday life in a very fragmented way. So I find that unless I theorize, unless I offer from my own external position, of course, unless we can offer some sort of a theoretical language to them, they are failing to make their points before the larger world, and that's how
2, 3, So I can write down some stuff. If you're not able to finish it, we'll take it up tomorrow also.
I am, sir, working on the philosophy
Between?
Vowels of Bengal and Bobdila.
Oh, okay.
So regarding the philosophy of vowels, I am facing a problem of conception. As you say, empirical study.
Mm.
Some says vowels are the little bit part of Buddhist monks. Some say they are the Sufis. Some are pointing about the mystical beliefs. But while I have acquainted with the vowels, it's totally different.
Mm.
It is a way of living, as I supposed to be. And as I have been forbid to tell about in publics.
Oh.
It is a confidential matter. But the thing is that how I should represent people in general, while I am contrasting with Bob Dylan and Baul, which point of view I will take?
Yeah.
Mystical, Buddhist, or the Sufist?
Okay, which discipline thing are you coming from?
I am from English literature.
Literature. No, the reason I am saying is, see, if an anthropologist, so much of our research, especially for those of you who are actually part of research programs, is I think today dictated by the disciplines you belong to.
Yeah.
That is the expectation of discipline. So when you write a thesis, it's being submitted to anthropology or English or philosophy. All of them are read differently. The expectations are different, right? So for example, if you are doing this as an anthropological study, in the standard way in which, for example, in our own research method training for our students, which we do at NIAS, we would only map the research proposal in general, but you will first have to allow the field to speak completely. It's not about your decision whether it's about Buddhist, Sufis, nothing. An anthropological work will give you a mapping of the field the way it speaks to you, right? So what do I mean by that? You will then describe and give a so-called honest account of, okay, I spoke to this bowl singer and she said etc., and the other person said something else and third person said something else. That's all you can do legitimately. There is no representation of them. There is no theorizing which is not coming from the field. So suppose there is one, it doesn't have to be many, even if there is one bowl singer who tells you, there is this problem between Buddhist view and Sufi view and etc., spiritual view. We think we are all, we don't believe in religion or something like that. That you can use as your entry point into theorizing. See, I'll tell you I think there are many questions about the nature of theory, and although that's not what I wanted to do, I think I can see why it's important, because as I said, even if you want to talk about technology and theorize about technology, what do we do, correct? So nature of theory does many things, and one of the things we have written extensively in the cracked mirror is to say how theory has an ethical component. And we privilege theory so much that the only thing which people react to in cracked mirror, one of the things I'm sure they react to many things. One of the things they are not very happy about is the fact that we bring theory into the idea of ethics into the idea of theorizing, because theorizing is supposed to be cognitive. It's supposed to be about truth of the world. Why are you bringing ethics? And our point is, every act of theory in social theory is an act of your judgment. The implications of how you define it can go right up to the government policy. Suppose you say vowels are all anti-religion, and you write it, you think you have done a thesis and finished. Then there are some, who knows, some Sena somewhere, or I don't know, there is a TMC or anybody else will read it, and next time they get a chance, they will say, oh, there are these vowels who are saying the anti-religion, let's go beat them up. But I am saying, before you write it, should a theoretician anticipate the ethical consequences of it? We think if you follow an idea of theory from the natural sciences, you would say, no, that is the way the world is. I am just stating the way the world is. I am not adding anything to it. But that is false even in natural sciences. There is very many interesting work on that. we can talk about it later. So what I'm trying to say is, this is, see, the question of representation you should think about very carefully, I think. That is, you should really agonize over the fact, why do you want to say what you want to say? So let's assume, suppose you discover something about the bowls and you think, oh, if I say it, it's not good for them. Will you say it or should you say it? All these questions is part of it, but most important for me is the theory has to come from, the concepts have to come from the field. I think as part of, I'm sure many there are anthropology students here, that's the first lesson we now tell our students. Don't even think of saying, I want to say what they are. You are nobody to say anything about what they are. They have to be, but you can be a good field researcher by making them say what they may not say first time. That's a skill. That is, let me put it this way, that is a legitimate form of doing theory. Theory is not just about writing these very complex, so the example you're giving of Lacan. Suppose these balls, first time obviously they don't want to talk about Lacan, they won't talk about I and whatever, but by talking, you spend 6 months with them, talking to them, they say somewhere the question of the self and the fact that the self seems to be outside me. Then you can build on that and show that it's relation to other people who have said like that. But the first utterance should come from them, or the concept should come from them. Which means the ego of a theorist, and this is the problem of a theory, theorist is about a little bit of an ego, and that's also what we're discussing. You go look at the field, you look at people doing something and say, well, they haven't understood themselves. It's the British reading. These people don't know what they are doing. I will explain to you what they are doing. We may be tempted because Lacan, Deleuze, and Kant, whatever it is, Naiyayikas, all of them are same thing. But because we know them and we say, I will explain to you what you are doing. Can we resist that? Or should we? Maybe the function of theory is to come out and say, no, you don't know it, I know it, and I'll tell you. You may say that's what theory means. So colonialism is fundamentally theoretical, or the theoretical stance which orders the world for whose people can't describe themselves. Maybe that is the case, but you have to take an ethical choice on the nature of that theory. Yeah.
My background is from English literature, so I have little exposure to philosophy. But my question falls back on the conversation you had with Triti Man, if I could recollect his name correctly. And basically, it focuses on the idea of karma that you proposed there. So the question is very basic. Is the understanding or the conceptualization of philosophy, does that have something to do with the jargon that we are using, or the language in which we are putting the concept?
Okay. No, this is also something which came up outside, and I said we should definitely talk about it because I think it's such an important question. And since I think for many of you this is very essential, I will do it tomorrow in greater detail, which is about the relationship between concepts. And these concepts can come from anywhere. You can be the Deleuzian, Kantian, whatever. But how to understand the question of, and for Deleuze, question of concepts is very important anyway. So, but how do we understand concepts as an idea, especially its relationship to language? And when you move from one language to another, what happens to the concepts? Because much of our problems is actually about moving from concept to across languages. So I will do that in greater detail because it's related to a very important question of translation and what does translation mean. But the question of jargon, I wouldn't be very worried, because part of creating a discipline is to create your technical vocabulary. So in the social sciences, people tend to see it as jargon, but the same thing if I say DNA or electron, they don't think it's jargon. They think that's the way the world is. Electron is okay, but you say hegemony is jargon you're using, But I am saying field theory is jargon, quantum field theory is another jargon. So, but it's part of disciplinary formations. Disciplines distinguish themselves from others by drawing boundaries on the concepts they have, and they will insist on the nature of the meaning of that. Restricting meanings of concepts is one of the first fundamental function of a discipline. So, you would say in English hegemony you might use, let us say, the common thing. In literature you might use. Political science will use it very differently. Philosophy will do it very differently, in the sense it will find theories of hegemony, functions of hegemony, and so on. And so each of the disciplines adds their own character to that term, but the terms are completely stateless. They are not citizens of any discipline. Disciplines take stateless subjects, concepts, and give them visa within each discipline in their way, and they form that term. So jargons, I am okay with it, in the sense that's what disciplines do. But the larger question of how concepts move across languages is something I'll do next. Sorry, yeah.
So I keep on bringing my research, but I think it's very relevant here. So if I could ask, if I could ask you, I'm basically trying to see the politics of sense and nonsense. Right? You talked about language and experience. So how these binaries between sense and nonsense. So can we really ask the nonsense to speak up and really think that can make sense to me? Right. So.
Well, empirically we have very good examples. I'm sure you have been reading a lot of stuff which empirically proves your point. So I won't name names of these thinkers, but I'm saying. Could be, I'm saying. I don't know. Yeah. Sorry, I'll say.
That question a bit.
Okay.
Because you were talking about the sense nonsense, and I feel there are works on that already. That suppose when you try to make sense of the nonsense, right? You were saying, isn't it that by attempting to make sense of the nonsense, you have already transferred the nonsense into the realm of the sense? The intelligible is kind of unintelligible always. It remains linked with the unintelligible and the impossible. Politics of the impossible, if I say. Politics of the possible, which was kind of written by, I forgot the name. What was the name of that lady? The politics of the possible, who writes? Kumkum Sangari. And from that again we have the Derridian concept of the possible, the impossible absolute. Now if you try to again kind of talk about the impossible, by giving example of the impossible, have you already not kind of brought it back into the realm of the possible?
So yeah, these kind of things which the French really like to do. No, it's I think it's part of the strategy. By the way, it's a discursive strategy you should discover in all these writers, because it's a very important function in doing that. But I mean, in a very simple sense, people would say the recognition of nonsense as a concept is already a cognitively meaningful term. So this is why concepts are so important to understand. The nonsense, what is nonsense, is only the content of a valid judgment that is nonsense.
The ease itself is kind of creating that the visibility and presence that the ease kind of.
Correct. Yeah, I mean, ease is, of course, everybody loves this. All our continental, even analytical, Russell wrote a big thing on this, because Heidegger made a whole career on it. Yeah.
Excuse me, sir. I will expose. If we look at the early Greek philosophers, then they always say that there is one morality. Socrates died for the state, but then if we look at the dramas, the later dramas of Greek, then we find, we all know the story of Agamemnon, where Agamemnon sacrifices a daughter for the sake of his state. So whether, and there, when we look at the story, that if he sacrifices his daughter, he is violating the
father and a daughter, and if he not go to state, then he is piloting himself as he is a king of a state. So therefore there is no fixed morality, I think. So whichever he is going to choose, that makes him a tragic character, or a tragedy falls upon him. So so here, if we don't, here we use, can we use the technology or not? If we can we go to use Facebook, Twitter
Where?
or not?
Huh?
If so can I go to use a Facebook, Twitter or not?
Okay.
If I'm not going to use Facebook, then I myself think that I'm not a modern man, or modernity is not in myself. And if I use it, then there is also there makes also some tragedy. It falls upon
Yeah.
me. So this is another one.
So you wait a minute. You are connecting Facebook and the Greeks. No, it's interesting. I'm saying, look, original research comes like that. Is that what you're doing?
So another question is that in Indian philosophy you have said that we are mixing the religion with science.
I said. Okay. Well, I didn't say that, but it's okay.
They
Let's.
are using,
Yes,
they are
yeah,
using along with religion
Correct.
and science. The examples, ISRO scientists are
Okay, correct.
temple with the
Yeah,
samples.
okay.
So are we more happy than the Western people? Those who are not doing such things.
No, okay, you are asking too many very. Then it will become like a satsang now instead of philosophy talk. We can have bhajan also at 6 o'clock then. No, but actually,
Philosophy is a very, I do myself think philosophy is a very toughest subject. Who can teach philosophy can teach every subject.
I don't know about that.
I do myself think.
Yeah, no, it may be possible. No, I mean, you have a very broad set of questions. I'm not responding to this directly to this question, but I know I can see. I want to use it to see what you are really struggling with. The question about how do we actually meaningfully connect things, take concepts, how do we interpret, like the things you're talking about, tragedy.
When we have more choices, whatever we choose,
Yeah.
that makes it tragic.
No, so what I'm trying to say is there are two lessons I want to draw from this. One quick lesson is that, lot of philosophers whom we read, and even a lot of social theorists and all that, they're quite unhappy people. Unhappiness is a very important, unhappiness it can be psychological unhappiness, or it can be intellectual unhappiness. A kind of a deep dissatisfaction which makes you write the kind of stuff you do. And not an accident that other than mathematicians, the single largest community which gets psychologically disturbed on the edge are philosophers. No, there are many examples of it. So but the other point you said, I want to use that point to ask a very important question. I mean, to bring it to our larger notice. How do you read texts which do not belong to your time, your space, and very dangerously I'm using the word your culture. You're sitting right in front of me, so I'll be very careful in using that. But you're with all this hybridity, post-colority, etc. How do we use that? How do we read a text? Are we putting your terminologies of tragedy onto some Greek fellow? Is that the sense of tragedy for Homer, the same sense of tragedy for us? Our sense of tragedy is Shah Rukh Khan. And like Homer's sense of tragedy is, I don't know. Is that what we are going to do? What I'm trying to say is it's a methodological question of reading texts. It's really a very serious question. How do you read others? And the others is not about East, West, German, Indians. Others is ourselves in a very fundamental sense. It's very deep. Although the West never engages with us, they have no problem. They don't think of hybridity, multiplicity, nothing, correct? In terms of the intellectual world. but we are happy to incorporate that. But the other, how do you read that? It's an ethics of reading which is so important, and I think part of the first fundamental training in method, research method, at least when I do that thing, to me it's an extremely important part of teaching research method, is to give you strategies for reading, which could be, for example, just like reading a field, you can't go and meet the bowls and say whatever you want. In the same way, what is the ethical engagement with the text and the read? It's a way, I think for at least research students, very important.
The last point you raised, it was kind of already hinting at the question I was thinking about asking. And this as you agreed to have an extended session, I'm asking again an extended question, which will take some more time for you to respond. In your book, Cracked Mirror, you were, I think, in the third section, because it was kind of written in a kind of a dialogue form, where Gopal Guru and you were kind of having a dialogue and exploring the issues, where you were talking about experience, how experience kind of comes to be shaped through certain relationalities, and it's not a kind of, it's a play, if I understood it in that way, it's a kind of a play of the particular and the general, which shapes the experience. In that sense, experience is not given or a universal category, but which also comes to be constituted, shaped in a certain kind of a relational way. Now, in that sense, experience also, I feel, remains linked with a certain sense of, I will not call universality, but to be able to connect, right? Sense of that we can share that the intelligible question is coming. That suppose your experience, if I am not able to connect somewhere at all, no one else is able to connect to your experience, then it may not gain that visibility or a kind of a recognition. So it also remains dependent to some sense of generality. Okay. And now in relation to the this question and the question of location, we all know calls for a certain specificity, and how certain, like if we say Indian experience, Western experience, American experience, where location is kind of operating as a kind of a qualifier or a marker of a difference, at the same time as a kind of a qualifier for your distinct experience from others. We all know, because I have heard it many times, that when you come to India, it's different because we have caste. And when I remember one person, I will not take the name. When you go out of India, there is no caste. When you come inside India, there is caste. So it's a kind of inside-outside he was kind of talking about, which is obviously for feeding on the thinking of location. Now, I would ask, or I would like to know, means how would you respond on how we can, how you would raise experience in relation to this?
Okay. Yeah, I think this point, I should clarify this point, because the experience thing has been coming around a bit.
Sorry, I'm interrupting. You were hinting at ontology in your JNU lecture, also ontology of the social, how it remains linked with the ontological question also.
Yeah. Yeah, the ontological question is easier to answer because that's the other book which I'm finishing with Gopal. We have just about finished it, I think. So you will read it sometime, hopefully, if it gets published. But that's actually on the social ontology. So we, after the Cracked Mirror, we really struggled with this question of saying how do you make sense of, you know, since there are so many anti-experiences here, I won't use the word experience. I'm trying to see what is the word you use other than experience actually. You know, so I mean we were also responding to this question of how to talk about questions like what happened with Rohit Vemula and various others in the cow lynching and so on.
Interview you gave to Dalit Camera,
Yeah.
you were talking about that or these specific questions.
Yeah, so how do we then theorize or think about it? And so we have gone back to the question of the everyday. So it's a kind of a social ontology, so maybe part of that is answered. But let me clarify something in a very simple, one philosophical approach to the question of experience. Simple, commonsensical. And I think it will also answer to the question of the large, many, multiple experience, etc. There are two senses of the word experience. Experience as a simple, if you like, a cognitive or biological thing, is a conscious awareness of certain sensory modalities which happen on you. You're conscious, some kind of notions of recognizing, oh, I'm open my eyes, I see the room, I touch this, it's cold to touch, okay, but every description of it is after that cognitive event has happened. And that's why, you know, like the Nayayikas and the way they would talk about cognitions is actually very interesting. All their analysis is only through cognition. So, for example, a very simple example, when I see smoke, I infer there is fire. Now, the experience, so they will break it up as, first there is an experience, there is a conscious awareness of seeing smoke. That's the first state. Then you have to have a second cognitive state, which may be a memory that whenever I see smoke there could be fire. Then it leads to a third cognitive state. If experience is transitory, then there is nothing called multiple experiences at all. It is our descriptions of it, it is our representation of it which can be multiple or singular. Experiences are an event, it just happens. Experience happens. You know, and I think we need, that is the real ontology of experience itself. It happens and then I report it. The reporting is another experience, it is not that experience, and the reporting can be multiple. And I think that to read Saswat's point and extend on it, the reduction of an experience into one singular is the problem. But everything is a report of that experience, some event which has happened to you. That's one way of looking at it.
Can you say that locations are also produced in that sense?
Yeah, okay, so the location role, okay, you know, as I said, I think it says something good and also a little bit problem with this question of, you know, the Indian issue.
To some extent it is produced then also.
No, it is produced, but what I am saying is, what I think is good and a weakness is that it's only in India that I really encounter this question about using Indian. You know, in no other context people they use these terms very easily across as locational terms. I think when we say Indian, what people react to, and I think very correctly, is an essentialization of Indian, that's all. But very often it is just used as saying, as I said, I could say in Kharagpur I had this experience, you know, but when I am talking to a German, I may not want to say Kharagpur I had, I say, oh, when I was in India, you know, I had, well, definitely I will say this, okay, this I will say 100 times, I have said it many times. I say, whenever I am in Bengal, I have the best rasagullas or sandesh or whatever we had now. You can never get the sweet like I had now. What is it called? Not cham cham? Kheer kadam, okay. Okay, you can't get it anywhere else. And and saying that, you know, only in Bengal I get, or only in Calcutta, or now it's not Calcutta, it's Kharagpur, so I say Bengal. It's that reference is not about essentializing Bengal, it's about giving information about, if you like, the location of the experience, or my marking something in that experience. So maybe, but I think it's worth thinking about. I agree with that, that there is, I think it shows that we are more sensitive thinkers when we are problematizing our use of that term.
I'm working on Aga Shahid Ali, a Kashmiri American poet who went to America. Now, listening to these things, what I'm thinking is, what should be the frame, what should be the modality? Should I go for diasporic or should I go for anthropological study? Reading
Which department are you in?
English.
See, this is the point. You know, the discipline is going to be a matrix, but thankfully English is now in such a state of confused personality, whatever, schizophrenic, that in a good sense, I mean, you know, that you don't know whether you're doing political science or sociology or philosophy or whatever, which is good. I think that's an extremely important part of it. But again, as I said, it really depends on your, if not because you're in English it's so split, but it depends on your research proposal, I think. In the sense, what is it that you are trying, your research is supposed to do? You know, that's really going to dictate what perspective you want to take. Why are you doing this research? What do you want to show at the end of it?
Memory and space and how it works in his poetry. I mean,
Okay, so you want to show how memory and space works in his poetry, correct? Is that the end thing you want to show? Then whatever you need to invoke to show it, you will have to invoke it. You know, for me, a lot of research questions are like problem questions. I have a problem, I need to resolve that problem. What is the kind of conceptual tools I use to do that? So that's why the clarity of why you're doing what you're doing is extremely important, especially in research programs. Otherwise it will diffuse, it will go everywhere. I know I want to show this very important connection between memory and location, okay, and that should drive every methodological step you take. You know, that's always should be at the top of your mind. Where is the question of memory and space in this, if I choose this perspective or that perspective? And it's good that you know what you want with it, because a lot of students and a lot of us, when we do a research project, we really don't know what we're looking for when we do that. But I think in your case it's a little more clearer.
Sir, on the question of theory and experience,
On question of
theory and experience,
theory and
inside and outside. Firstly, how do we really understand how? So how do we understand the difference between what Marx calls false consciousness? Because he also in capital says they know not that they're doing it, but they're doing it.
Yeah.
Like you say, theoretical Brahmins and empirical Shudras. There has to be an outsider who's coming and then, trying to explicate what's really happening with those who say they're experiencing something. And what's the difference really here? I mean, when you are saying that, okay, they know not that they're attributing values and relationships between objects, but they're doing it. And
Who?
when Marx talks about
Yeah.
false consciousness,
Correct. Yeah.
when he's speaking about commodities,
Yeah. Yeah. Correct. Yeah.
he's also saying that they
Correct.
know not that they're
Yes.
doing it, but they're doing it.
Yeah.
So how different is it when you?
It is not very different, because Marx comes in his particular case of a long tradition of scientific theorizing, and the idea of theory being very deeply influenced as forms of knowledge which the world of subjects do not have. For science it's very, very simple. The objects of which science does theorizing are mute. They are the biggest idiots in the world. They don't know anything. They are just objects like chairs and tables. And when the theory idea gets into the social world, you are able to recognize they are humans, but they are not too different from things, and therefore the task of a theorist is to discover. So two things. One, so there are two very important points there. One is, what is it a theory of? So for example, a theory can be macro. Okay, and the macro theory can see connections between all of you which the person sitting in the last row may not know the first row connection. But since I am seeing the last and this simultaneously, I can discover the links. So the theory as the God's eye is a very important metaphor of theory, which is also the very famous Platonic idea that you live in an empirical world, you step out of it, go to the realm of the extraordinary. So I look at the ordinary, I understand the ordinary, I come back to the ordinary and shine light on the ordinary. So theory will look at individual empirical phenomena, go out and look at the whole thing, come back and explain the world in a different manner. Scientific theory, unification in scientific theory works like that. I think the best classic example is Newton. Newton, phenomenally important step in his understanding of theory was this. In the case of Newton, he was trying to understand what is a motion, how things move, right? That's all he was trying to do. But a great Platonic move he does, or a kind of like that, is to move away from the world of motions. That is, stones move, objects move, humans move. But then when he goes up, he suddenly recognizes earth also moves, and he understands something very important about motion. He says they are all the same type of things. earlier the Aristotelian, the earth moving in the heavens was very different from the stone movement. For Newton, the recognition that all these things, including waves, those movement is all this, there is only one thing called motion, and therefore his whole project of what we becomes physics is just a description, as he says in his Newton's Principia, his magnum opus, that the whole task of that book is just to distinguish true motion from apparent motion. There is only one motion in the universe. Post Newton, there are no different types of moving, there is only one moving. In a sense, for the scientific thing. So, sorry. So, you see the point. That is the kind of one notion of the theory. Looking down, unifying from outside, and when taken into the social science context, it has a tendency either, what is the other famous phrase which Marx used, village idiots, because he thinks they are like that, and you have to, and the left has not lost that, by the way. It's always had that problem of being leaders and the proletariat who need to be guided, who need to be pulled out, who need to be told, correct? And they think that's the nature of the world, society anyway. But I think all theory doesn't have to be that way. You know, cosmopolitan theories or attempts at cosmopolitanism is an attempt to say, you know, your description of yourself is the final legitimate word. We may disagree with it, etc. At least if there is human autonomy, you describe it, you may be wrong, your description may be wrong completely, it does not matter. You have the first right to say what you say. So, you could have different notions of theory. So, literature can come up with ideas of theory which are very different from a scientific. So, this is the real fundamental problem we have, and this is the central question which you need to think about. If theory's function is to produce knowledge, okay, then it depends on what you mean by knowledge. The whole point of theory's function is to produce new knowledge. That's what theory does, right? It has to say something new about the situation you are in. Then it depends on the definition of knowledge in each of your disciplines. That is really what will indicate the thing.
So one question. Perhaps this is tangential to what I've asked you already. There is a high degree of academic sycophancy in Indian academics, wherein I mean, we say we live in a post-colonial world, but then if I don't call my professor sir, then I wouldn't receive the treatment that I'm entitled to anyway. I mean, you have to say, sir, I respect you in a very indirect sense, in every manner that you behave in front of the faculty.
Is there, I don't know about Kharagpur, I am surprised, I don't think it will happen, but yeah, in India and maybe some universities and all, yeah.
I mean, unless that, I mean, there are a lot of PhD scholars also who complain that unless they work through the ways of their guide, they wouldn't get.
Which department are you in?
So I'm in
Human.
sociology.
Sociology, is it?
Even the
Okay.
PhD scholars can be very manipulative.
Yeah, I understand that.
I was just waiting for this.
So my question is, sir, in this aspect, sir, in this problem that we really so often hear about, what is the role of the non-academics as outsiders to understand this phenomenon of sycophancy? That you have to really, this idea of Guru Devo Bhava no matter what. I mean, what is the role of the non-academicians? Since you've spoken about politics today, what is the role of the non-academicians who really do?
You know, I'd say, you know, the sad truth is the outsiders don't really care about academics. No, it's a real sad truth. I'm telling you, because when Bangalore University closed its philosophy department, we tried to mobilize something to say, oh, protest and all. Nobody cared. We can't get anybody for getting the larger people, because you know, one of my big projects I'm trying to raise funds for is philosophy in public, trying to actually do various interventions in the public on philosophy. I find it extremely difficult. You know, they are, with scientists, they still have some kind of a thing, oh, they're producing something, you know, something they have about science. But the larger outsiders, vis-a-vis social science and humanities and all that, is like quite, they just don't understand us. And they don't, I think, understand the tribal culture of academics. like what kind of tribal world we live in, no? Because somewhere it doesn't interest them. They don't tell their children to go into academics. You know, another interesting point, a disproportionate amount of people in academics come from academic families or influence very deeply within those family structures. And that's why the first generation learners are so important. Unless they come into academics, it will be a very incestuous round. And you need to break that, and that's the only way you can get, you know. So there is a, yeah, I don't know, I know I'm not answering your question because it's also an interesting and difficult question. But in Indian universities, there is a kind of a problem about this. But you know, I also think as a PhD guide, whose students never call me sir, but it has not changed anything, because you know, my constant struggle with them is this, because especially because it's philosophy, I want them to be independent, autonomous creatures, you know, taking decisions and doing things, reading, coming up with original ideas. I'm willing to challenge them, discuss with them. But so I want them to be like really independent thinkers. But sometimes I feel when they don't read the stuff I tell them, etc., I feel like shaking them up and saying, no, you are not independent thinker, listen to me now to do this. And I have to control myself, because you know, that's a position I have to take. How do I deal with them when they don't follow what I think are important guidelines? It's a very difficult, you know, like you said, I mean, having students is one of the most intricate relationship, I think, because they're both adults, and you want them to be independent thinkers, but you want them to be guided by you also. It's a
Indian students are not comfortable with the idea of radical equality. Are they comfortable? They are not. No, you are not.
Can we sum up entirely as Indian students are not radical in that sense?
Indian is a, what is the Indian here? Yeah. No, but it's an interesting question. Are there, I still have to meet them tomorrow, so should I be very polite or not fully polite? No, what I am saying is, okay, let me tell you one stereotype. I don't believe in it, but a lot of faculty might say this. Many times when we discuss, people say it. This is not about, so the Indian, not all Indian students or whatever, but it is true that Indian students are more dependent as students, to put it, you know, in the sense, when you are really angry, we say, oh, they are like kids. There's a lot of dependency, you know, a very parental dependency of some kind, in a sense.
We come from highly Oedipalized setup, you know.
Okay, that, yeah.
Family structures like that.
But yeah, no, what I mean by the dependency, so there may be reasons for it. What I mean by dependency is that when you allow them to be completely free and whatever, independent, it's quite difficult for us to negotiate with it. You know, in the center which I opened in Manipal, everybody, this is for master's students, not even for PhD students. And I thought it was a very egalitarian space. Nobody called anybody by sir. None of the students. Students would all call me by my name, or the other teachers, or anybody else. And in a campus like Manipal, it was terrible. I mean, we were like, I think, hated by all the others. With a very conservative feudal town, that is, you know. But we said this is part of the notion of education. And I think it, you know, after the initial shift, it works very well. I thought it worked very well in that sense. But you still have to drive students. You know, in the sense, I'll give you an example, very quick example. We will, for all the things which I do in my course, even now or at Manipal, we'll give a written document, I'm sure which all of you do, which is if the assignment is due on Friday at 12 p.m. Okay? It's written, told to them one semester before, an exact dates on which is due, including the final term paper, on Friday, November 30th, 12 p.m. And you can't give more, you'll have penalties. For some odd reason, you come 1 hour late, it's 10% or whatever, some rules given to them. whole semester they won't. These are very good students also. They won't come discuss it, nothing. Then on the day of submission, after a whole semester we give in print, I tell them in class 100 times, day of submission they'll come to discuss or argue. And the best thing I had was this: these two students came, and one person gave it a 12.10. I said, if you can give, or 12.5. I said, if you can give it a 12.5, we have told you one semester, how can you not give 11.55? What is it that is so difficult? And then two other students who had submitted on time came to argue with me and said, no, what is big thing in 5 minutes? What do you lose between 12 and 12.5? You're making a big fuss. This is okay, it's nothing, just 5 minutes. This negotiation, is really shocking to me. We hear it all the time, it's about negotiation. I'm sure, I hope you have better PhD systems in place, but with all such good students, even in NIAS, you have some really bright and serious people, but if they have to submit the proposal on the last day of November 30th, one email will come. I request extension for 3 days. I mean, I really don't understand this point about negotiation. If there is one thing which captures our thing, it's about negotiation. For marks, for work, for submitting, everything. Maybe that's a part of the thing. Sorry, you had some. I'll come to you.
What you said today, is something that can be called as decolonial project.
Yeah, correct.
In the domain of philosophy. And it reminds me of what Hamid Dawasi, although not an Indian, has said that can non-Europeans think? Where he jokingly said that when Mozart sneezes, it is music. In Indian music, it's no music. So I agree with that. That's absolutely fine. But you also importantly say that we have to focus on the methodology. That's the most important.
Correct.
And I would love to know about how you concretize on that methodology.
Yeah.
Because that is what we have to encounter in
Correct.
everyday practice.
Yeah.
Because when I supervise a student for the PhD and she or he happens to be working on, say, poetry and nature, and I say read Meera Bayandur's work on nature in Indian philosophy, and she incorporates that or engages with that, and the board of research says, well, your thesis is purely a philosophical thesis. Where is literature there? So this problem is an everyday problem in Indian universities where you have to, again borrowing the term that is often negotiating with the board of research studies, the other colleagues in the department, this disciplinary theory.
Yeah.
Stress. So this methodology is important because if I want to stick to Indian concept of nature and push Wordsworth away, bringing him in a different way, I'm not allowed that space. That is problem number one. So that is where your point of methodology comes as very crucial. And I would like to know how you concretize on that. Second is, Sundar, you said that although jokingly, but it's very true, I have seen it in my own eyes, that people not related to philosophy are doing better philosophy. You yourself as an example, you are a person of physics, but you are doing more important things on philosophy. But the department of philosophy is going on with that old stuff of this colonial hangover of Kant and others, etc. So how to tackle that and why does it happen? And lastly, this question of empirical sutra and theoretical grounding. This might sound a little contentious, but I would like to have your take on that. I asked the same question to Gopal. He said, I refuse to comment on that.
Go.
What is the problem if Arundhati Roy says something on Ambedkar? The Dalit camera wrote so huge piece of attacking Arundhati about her take on Ambedkar. So what is your observation on that? I just said that you can look at her as the theoretical something. She has the right to talk on the empirical sutra. If we do that, then are we not moving for some kind of what should I say, phenomenological reductivity that no one is allowed to enter into the space to which he or she is not belonging?
Okay, so the first one, methodological, and that's actually related very closely to the question of concepts. which I'll really do tomorrow in detail. But I'll tell you, I think the way it is this, that the concept of nature is not bound to any discipline, and that's the trick, right? So I should be able to get a grasp on the concept of nature, draw upon its meanings in other disciplinary matrices like in philosophy or Indian philosophy, but convert it, translate it into its avatar in literature. We do this all the time with my philosophy, students, because many of the students who do PhD in philosophy come from many different. I take students from many different disciplines, and they work in problems which can be quite different in the sense compared to what would think is very traditional philosophy. And now philosophy is so dynamic; it's changed so much. So one of the ways in which you do it is to say, well, you are. So for example, I'll give you one example. I have a very good student who was working on education, on tribal education, and he suffered through it, and he got very involved, but he was not really working out something. Then he suddenly discovered Bergson. For some reason that spoke to him. He tried various authors, we had a lot of discussion, etc. But suddenly something struck him with Bergson. It everything connected for him. So he could have made that thesis a sociological thesis because he did field work, and I really like my philosophy students do empirical field work, because philosophy as text is something I don't believe in, just like sitting at the text. So he could have done an anthropological work on education and tribal education. He could have converted into a sociology study of relationship of institutions of governance in Nilgiri, where he did his field work. But through this Bergson, the same set of concepts and data that he had got completely converted into a philosophy thesis. So I think concepts allow you that mobility, because concepts are not defined. They don't come with a very clear definition. They are amenable in each theory that you use them in. So that may be one strategy, but you can't deal with board of studies will overcome every strategy that you have, because especially our university board of studies will, that is nothing, that's God. So you just have to bow down and do what they say. But I think as an intellectual strategy, this is very difficult for them to understand what you're doing. And I think that really, and that's something speaks very important about concepts, and that's why I want to talk a little bit more about it tomorrow maybe. And the second one you said was about oh yeah, philosophy. No, I think, see, I'm critical of philosophy in the sense of saying, why is it that, okay, everything, by the way, everything I was saying today was only with one unasked question. That's the background question, which is, I wanted all of you to think, how will you think about technology using Deleuze and others you've been hearing so far? That's all. It's not a question of whatever. I wanted you to say, how is it that I can make a meaningful understanding of them, other than mimetic appropriation? Oh, he said that, I can use it for this. No. To engage them critically, all that you heard, how does that matter to your experience of technology in the world around you? How can you use all that you heard about Deleuze when you pick up your smartphone and pick up the call next time? So that's really the question I'm saying, because that's an exercise in how you use system. So I'm saying philosophy training, I think, is important. Even for me, although I went as a physics student and my formal degree is in physics, for 5 years I went to I found a very good philosophy teacher, and somebody said, oh, he's supposed to be interesting, why don't you go ask him? So I went to him one day. I told him, I want to sit in your class, I want to see what you guys do, because I had, like all teenagers and all, we were reading Nietzsche and all that, and I thought philosophy, let's see what these idiots do, because I was from physics and I thought, we're doing something. But I was very keen on doing philosophy. In India, if it had been philosophy, I may have done philosophy also. So I went there, he said, come sit in his class. So I sat in all his classes, I took some other classes. So 5 years I did philosophy. 2 years it took me to understand the whole nature of the discipline, including the way language functions and all that. But that training, I think, helped me a lot. But because I was always a kind of an outsider, in fact the philosophy teacher told me, why don't you get a PhD in philosophy itself? But it was much easier getting it in physics. So I said, I may as well do it in physics, because I was done with it and they are paying me for doing it. So what I'm trying to say is that there is a particular kind of training you need to be within the inside, but a particular training of being on the outside which allows you to not get caught in the local politics of that discipline. And if we can reach a state like that, I think it's very good. That's why interdisciplinarity allows us to do it. English as a discipline has become like that in India, for example. Sociology is very restrictive.
English is also
Is
certain parts, yeah.
certain parts,
but
yeah.
most of the parts is very
Also because you have had lot more students entering English compared to other disciplines, and a lot of bright students are also there in English, because otherwise if we had good philosophy departments and other science, I'm sure many of you people doing English today would be doing all that. Unfortunately, we have pushed all of you into some very vague colonial discipline called English.
also
So
because more job opportunity. Whenever I ask
whatever,
students
correct,
that,
exactly, they'll say all that. So I think that's part of the question. So I think we need to engage a little more on what philosophy really does. And the critique of philosophy I still have is this textual obsession. With something which is very interesting. Every famous philosopher who disagrees and breaks away and goes off begins by critiquing this obsession with the text, and then they create a big become a big philosopher, and people who follow them are stuck with text. It's very odd. They're not reading what the first person is saying. Get out of this scholastic mode, right? The greatest critique of the Aristotelian scholasticism. And then new philosophies come, but when we follow those philosophers we still end up like that. So I think that's why philosophy has to speak to the world. It's a very empirical thing for me at least. I'm saying it speaks to the world, it is outside the text, and it illuminates the nature of the world. And okay, so I won't go too long because it's too late. I'll end the thing that is see, when Gopal said he won't comment on it, then I should not say anything after that. But as far as I understood it, one of the problems was Arundhati Roy's invocation of Gandhi there. The figure of Gandhi was a very big problem, and using that as a form of understanding or writing, even if it is the greatness of Ambedkar, was a potential tension. Gandhi is a problem for communities who have to figure out how to deal with him. And in this case, in my limited understanding, you are asking a larger question. Does it mean that she can't write about it? And that's really what, as the second part on lived experience, we do that. We change that position. I mean, in the first case, why can't an upper caste write about Dalits, for example? Not because they don't have an intrinsic right. One, they don't have access to lived experience, but that's okay. But as I also mentioned in the book, that if you are an oppressor, you can write about the experience of oppressing others, and that's legitimate. So caste writing can occur from various things, because you can't say, because you are part of the problem. But the second most important point is this: the asymmetry of representation. I think that's a very genuine problem which we still are under. That is, the number of accounts of Dalits by upper caste as against the number of accounts of upper caste by Dalits is still very asymmetrical. It's just like representing. Yesterday I was in Delhi for this workshop on just telling Saswat about University of Potsdam and Delhi University. They have a big project Potsdam on cosmopolitanism. So yesterday was the last day of a workshop. I had to give some talk there, and there are all these German PhD students, quite a big crowd, and they are all most of the people, especially in Germany, work on India. Enormous amount of anthropologists work on India from Germany. How many Indian students are actually working on Germany? Anthropology is never about the symmetrical relation. I know of students in the US who were doing anthropology, very good students, but who said they wanted to study American society, because they said, don't send us back to India. We know your language, we live in your society, we want to observe your community, your society, and do our thesis on it. Even today, it's so difficult. After all these years, we are still, I'm saying that's why my question about the decolonial project is so deep. We had 5 of our students from Manipal go to various universities in the US, for many of them in anthropology and philosophy thing. So recently when I was there, I met all of them, very bright students, they all got scholarship and went. Everybody is disillusioned in 1 or 2 years. They are saying nothing has changed. They are all telling us go back to India, do some tribal stuff. They have no connection to any of it. They are only allowed the capacity to study yourself. They are not, we don't have the capacity to study Germany or France or the US. I mean, look at Ashish Das saying somebody can write about Calcutta, but none of us can write about the countries we live in. So I think that as long as the asymmetry question is there, I think the Arundhati question will remain. Yeah. Okay, thank you. So tomorrow, what time do we meet? Tomorrow? 11. Isn't it too late? I have to leave by 1.